Years ago, in a far-off land called Kentucky, I served a congregation in the humble surroundings of a place called Salvisa of Kentucky. And Salvisa was a fabulous place for Chris and myself because it was my first congregation to serve as a pastor. They, however, were a student church and had had many pastors over the years and could tell exactly what those student pastors were taking in school by what they would preach about on a Sunday morning. If you talked about the Old Testament, you must be taking George Coates' introduction. If you're talking about the New Testament, especially anything in Corinthians, then you're taking Dr. Graham's course in New Testament with the book of Corinthians and the other writings of St. Paul. They could tell exactly what was going on, and their mission as a congregation was to serve the seminary by serving as the churches that the seminary students would be serving as pastors. And in that church, I knew two wonderful people named Ezra and Eunice Jones. And one Sunday morning, I stood in front of this group in the congregation, and I began my sermon by saying, "Today I am telling you a story according to Anderson's Revised Substandard Fractured Legends and Bible Stories." I'm still working on writing those down someday, and Ezra told me that I should. So today I revert back to Anderson's Revised Substandard Fractured Legends and Bible Stories for your interest, for your education, and because it's something I already know about. Once a long time ago, there was a gentleman by the name of Abram. Now, Abram was a devout individual. He was a good man. He was well-to-do. He had many cattle, many sheep. The way that they would tell about wealth in biblical times was having the sheep that would cover 100 hills. It doesn't mean you could go out and count 100 hills. It just meant the guy was like Ben Cartwright. He had more sheep than he could count. Or in Ben's case, more cows and horses than he could count. But the fact of the matter is, Abraham was well-to-do, and he was married to a beautiful lady by the name of Sarai. And in their old age, God came to Abram and said to him, "Tell you what, I will be your God if you will be my people." Sounds interesting. So they struck up a deal and decided that Abraham's people would follow God and do what God asked them to do. Well, God asked them to sell the home in the suburbs of Ur, where Abraham was from, pack up the Winnebago and the family SRV, and get ready to take a little trip. So they packed up their servants, they packed up their cousins and nieces and nephews and anybody else that would come along. And they took off in a direction they knew not where they were going because God was going to guide them. And how many of us would do that tomorrow? I know. Sounds a bit ludicrous, doesn't it? Sounds absolutely ridiculous. Why anybody would do a thing like that, but that's what they did. And they took off and they started traveling, and all kinds of marvelous things happened along the way. They met a great king who fell in love with Sarah and nearly got Abraham killed. And they had all kinds of wonderful adventures, but the one thing they did not have was an heir. Now, she became Sarah as we go along. We're going to save that for another time. But Abram became Abraham, and she became Sarah, and they were told by God, at least Abraham was, "Come out here and look at the sky." And 100-year-old Abraham walks outside and looks up at the sky. Was he really 100? He was just very old. And old age in that day, for those of us that have reached that time in our lives when we get the senior citizen cup of coffee at Hardee's, in those days they respected people who were old. It's not like the world today where you can only get a discount at Hardee's and McDonald's, but that's another time altogether. They respected people who were old, and so the storytellers gave him an old age, and 100 sounds good, especially when you consider the rest of the story. God says, look up at the stars in the sky. Look at all those marvelous stars. There was no pollution. If you lived in my neighborhood, there was no Goodyear or Goodrich or Firestone spewing all kinds of junk up in the sky and basically hiding the beautiful lights that exist up there. And so Abraham looks at the stars and says, yeah, he'd seen them a few times in his life, right? He says, yeah. And God says, Tell you what I'm going to do. You be my people, you be my man, and I will give you as many descendants as there are stars up in that sky, even more. Now, Abraham was no fool. He wasn't going to pass up a good deal like a lot of kids. I mean, having a lot of children's children in the Jewish tradition, or what was becoming the Jewish tradition, in their particular tradition, they would understand it as being remembered, as being immortalized, because immortality exists in being remembered by the generations that follow you. And Abraham and Sarah had the disadvantage of not having any direct descendants who were going to remember them and pass on their story from generation to generation to generation for years and years and years to come. They would be forgotten. Abraham knew this. This was a very intriguing offer. And Abraham said, well, there's one problem. Sarah is 99 years old and she's barren. She's never been able to conceive, no children. And he said, we tried, but things just didn't happen. And God says to Abram, look, if I promise you children, you're going to have children. You're going to have a son. Sarah, in the meantime, is on the other side of the barn. She peeks around the corner and she starts to giggle. And Abraham hears the giggling, and God hears the giggling. And God says, Sarah, why are you laughing? And she said, I'm not laughing. And God said, oh, yes, you are. Well, I guess laughing is a better reaction than running off screaming into the wilderness, which most people I know would do hearing such news at the age of 99, or 89, or 79, or 69, or 62, or any other age for that matter that does not involve being young enough and spry enough and energetic enough to keep up with a newborn and a toddler and a 2-year-old. So there they were, 9 months later, the proud parents of a baby boy by the name of Isaac. Now, Isaac, his name is very significant here. It's Hebrew for laughter. See the connection? Mama laughed, the kid gets named Laughter. Thank goodness she didn't run off screaming into the wilderness. Who knows what his name would have been. But here he is, a beautiful kid. He's around 12 years old, perhaps, for the purposes of our story today. And Abraham gets another visit from God, which is not that unusual. Abraham and God are very close. And God comes to Abraham and says, I want you to do something for me. And Abraham says, what's that, Lord? Anything you want. I'm your man. He said, I want you to take Isaac up on that mountain over there, and I want you to sacrifice him to me. And Abram said, are you sure about this? And God said, yes, Abram, it's what I want you to do. He said, Lord, that boy's my life. He's his mother's life. Are you sure this is what you want me to do? He said, yes, Abram, it's what I want you to do. In giving up that boy, not only would he be giving up his immortality and being remembered for generations to come, but he would also be giving up the future of his people, who would follow him as their leader. He would be giving up his very life itself, because at his age, one of the most important things that drove him to get up every morning was not just following God and having these wonderful adventures, following God around the countryside, but also watching that boy grow. But Abraham was a faithful man, and so he decided, yes, Lord, I will do it. So, as Cheryl read, he packed up his knapsack, he packed up a knife, and cut some wood the day before, and on the day they went over, he and Isaac and 2 servants took off up to the mountain. They got about 2/3 of the way up, and Abraham saw the spot where God wanted him to perform the act. He said to the servants, you stay here for a little bit. Isaac and I will be fine. The servants are looking around. Where's the lamb? Nothing was said. They walked up the mountain. Dad, where's the lamb? Don't worry, son, God will provide. They get to that spot, and the two of them get busy and build an altar. And Abraham puts the wood on the top of it. Then he takes his son and binds his hands and places him on the altar. He takes a knife out of his satchel, and he raises it high above the boy. And just as he's about to bring it down, a voice of the angel of God says, "Whoa, wait a minute. Abraham, put down the knife. Don't hurt the boy. You've done well. God knows you are faithful." Now, there are some who would say that what we were actually witnessing here was the very first example of a ventriloquist, as Isaac was laying there going, "Abraham, put down the knife." Not really, but it's a nice thought. But can you imagine what we would think today of a father and a son were to have this kind of experience? What kind of a relationship or what kind of an effect it would have on the relationship between a father and a son? Apparently, when the boy heard the rest of the story, and I'm reading a lot into this, so you can join me on the reading into it if you want to, but these stories are meant to be looked at and examined, and sometimes we have to fill in the gaps. Not that they're actually the way it happened, but just those little possibilities. That Isaac probably figured, Dad was sent by God to do this. What a wonderful experience he must be having following God the way that he does. And who knows, it may have been a motivating force in Isaac, because he would become the father of Jacob and Esau, and from them would come two great nations. Interesting story. He let the boy go, and they looked off into the thicket, and there was a ram with his horns caught in the brush. And they went over and grabbed the ram and prepared it and sacrificed it on the altar. God received his sacrifice and also his assurance that his man was indeed his man. Interesting, Abraham being as old as he is and having to make a new beginning back when he was living in Ur and really quite comfortable living in the suburbs with the Winnebago and the SRV and everything. I'm sure that Sarai was very happy with her name back in that time as well and all the things that were going on. But they took up the challenge, the opportunity to make a change, to boldly go where they had never gone before. Now, we've been through new pastors. I can honestly say, however, this is the first time I've actually been active in a congregation as a member that receives a new pastor. I've been the new pastor a couple times, and I heard about the new pastors that have come to my home church back in Ohio. But to actually be a part of the congregation and appear at the same time as we prepare ourselves to receive somebody brand new, we're on familiar territory in some respects. But in other respects, it's a whole new ballgame again. It's moving to a point where we haven't been in a long time. It's beginning again. It's change. And if there's one thing we are not really crazy about, especially those of us who get discounts at McDonald's and Burger King, we are really not, on the coffee anyway, are not too crazy about that change thing. It drives us nuts. We get used to the house in the burbs. We get used to the house in the country. We get used to the kids living just down the street or being in the house or just right next door. We get used to all these things, and then all of a sudden somebody comes along and poof, it's all changed and turned around for us, and we've got to look at it in terms of how are we going to deal with this time? But like Abraham, we have an advantage. God's with us. God is with us as He was when we issued the call to Holly. God was with Holly when she accepted that call. God has something in mind for us, and who knows what that could be. It's like the story of the man. I probably told you this story. I'm old, I tell stories over again. It's like the story of the man who was sitting in church one Sunday morning and he fell asleep. And he just started to snore. And it got louder and louder, and the wife kept hitting him in the ribs, as mine does, and it didn't do any good, and he kept snoring louder and louder, and finally the minister came down off the front of the steps and stood right next to him and said to everybody in the congregation, all those who are going to heaven, please stand up. And in one great rush, they all stood up at the same time, except for our friend, who was still snoring. And the pastor said, thank you, you may be seated. And then he said, and now everyone who's going to hell, please stand up. And that old guy shot up out of that pew like a beanpole and just stood there shaking in his boots and looking around. And the preacher looks at him and he says, sir, do you realize what you just stood up for? And he said, I don't rightly know, preacher, but it looks like you and I are in it together. Ladies and gentlemen, it looks like you and I are in it together. You know what I'm talking about, don't you, Bill? We're in this together, right? Did you have a good time? Do you think they had a good time? Did you all have a good time? Then show him. Thank you. I had a good time watching you as you prepared this congregation. We got the easy part. Old Chuckles, he had the tough part. He had to deal with all the misery loves company stuff. He had to deal with all that mechanical stuff that goes with being the intentional interim who's doing the transitional stuff. And you and I got to preach. And we got to be pastors. Probably more than Chuck did, though I'm sure he did have that opportunity from time to time. But you and I had that wonderful opportunity to reach out to these people and not worry so much about all the committee meetings and stuff, but treat them as a congregation and remind them of what it is to have a pastor treat them with love and respect and dignity, just the way you treated Bill, just the way you treat me when I'm up here doing these things on the pulpit. Just the way you're going to treat your new pastor when she arrives. I guarantee you she's going to make mistakes. And I'm going to tell you about some of those mistakes in the weeks to come. At least the possibilities. Not as the critical sense, but in the sense of your pastor, no matter who he or she is or will ever be or has ever been, we all share this one common trait. We're human. And we know what it's like to make new beginnings. Because we did it all the time in our careers with the new callings we received. And our families knew how scary it was to leave that nice, quiet neighborhood back where we were before, that wonderful congregation of loving, caring people, and to move on to a brand new group. It's a very interesting thing to do. But God with us, as God was with Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and all that followed and all that were with them, so God is with us as we begin all over again in God's love. Pray with me. We thank you, dear God, that you're with us through all the things we have faced and through all that we will face. We thank you for the choices that have been made and the decisions that have been passed on. We thank you for the opportunities you provide. Now guide us as we wait, as we prepare. Holly's getting ready, so must we. Be with us in Christ's name. Amen.